I want to show you what the book of Habakkuk is all about. This Old Testament book is really only 3 chapters long, but it's an amazing book. It addresses some of the very real questions that people like you and I still ask today. Questions like this: God, where are you when it looks like evil is prevailing? That's the very question that the prophet Habakkuk asked God, and the question that God answers in this book of the Bible. Let's take a look at the structure of Habakkuk. In Habakkuk chapter 1, the prophet starts by asking God these questions. God, where are you? Then God responds to these questions. Now, the response that God gives maybe isn't exactly the response that Habakkuk was expecting or looking for. And so he complains again in the rest of chapter 1 and actually into verse 1 of chapter 2. Then God responds to Habakkuk's second complaint here. And Habakkuk ultimately, he hears God, he understands that God is in charge, and while he may not know all the reasons, he trusts God's response. And so he ends the book with this beautiful song of praise. That's the basic structure of this short little book in the Old Testament. Now, we got to ask the question, why is it that Habakkuk felt like God was absent? Why did he feel like all the wicked were prevailing? Well, it helps us to understand some of the background of this book. Here's a timeline of the nation of Israel. God had established Saul and David and Solomon, and those guys had their problems, but in some ways, those were the golden years of the nation of Israel. After Solomon, the kingdom divides. There's Israel to the north, and there's Judah to the south. In Israel to the north, none of the kings were good. Assyria comes and destroys them in the year 722. Judah lasts a little bit longer. They have some good kings, some bad kings, but in the end, Babylon's going to come, and God's going to send them because Israel and Judah had disobeyed God. And so for several years, Judah's going to be in Babylon. God's disciplining them. Habakkuk lives in the time right before God sends Babylon to take the Jews captive. Now, in this time, there was a good king. His name was King Josiah. King Josiah was a bright spot. He came to power at 8 years old, and he followed God. Here's what 2 Kings says about him. It says, "And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and walked in all the ways of David his father, and he did not turn aside to the right or to the left." King Josiah did great. He brought these reforms. He was rebuilding the temple. They find the book of the law. But eventually, Josiah dies, and the reforms die with him. And so here's Habakkuk. There's no good king anymore, and Babylon's coming, and he's asking God, "God, where in the world are you?" Now, the way that King Josiah dies is important. It brings some light into why Habakkuk is asking all these questions about God. Doesn't look like anyone's in charge. A map of the time, I think, will prove to be helpful as we talk about this question. There are basically 3 world powers at the time. There's Egypt. Egypt here to the south. Then there's Assyria up here in the north. Then there's Babylon. Babylon is kind of the new kid on the block. They're rising in power. These other world powers, like Assyria especially, Assyria's being diminished. And Babylon, the great empire of Babylon just now, is coming to power. Well, Babylon is going to come into Assyria, and they're going to fight Assyria and ultimately take control of this area. Now, Egypt, for some reason, doesn't feel like that's in their interest. They want to help Assyria, and so they actually travel north, and they're going to fight the Babylonians. There's going to be a big battle, the Battle of Carchemish, that Babylon's going to win. Egypt's going to have to retreat back to their land. But one of the things you start to realize is just how Judah here is kind of small potatoes. right? There's these world powers all fighting around them. They're kind of getting trampled on. Perhaps part of the reason Egypt wanted to fight Babylon here isn't maybe because they wanted control of Assyria, but because, this is speculation, but perhaps it's because they thought that by fighting Babylon, helping Assyria, they would start to gain control of this area. Perhaps that's why Josiah didn't want Egypt to go north to help, and so he comes out to fight Egypt. He's not about to let this happen. Now, they meet in a battle at Megiddo, and in this battle, King Josiah is going to die. 2 Chronicles 35 describes this battle. Perhaps there's a hint in this battle that Josiah had the wrong motivation. Either way, Josiah loses and he dies. So Babylon is the real apparent winner here. Assyria is taken out, and Egypt has to retreat, and Josiah is dead. And so what you see here is it sure looks like Babylon is winning. Babylon now in charge of where Assyria had been, but that leaves kind of a power vacuum here. There aren't any good kings. And so who's going to rise to power here? Babylon. This is what Habakkuk sees, and this is a little bit of what terrifies him. And so as he talks to God, he's saying, God, where are you? The wicked are prevailing. We need a good king. There aren't any good kings anymore. And God has some surprising answers. Answers that Habakkuk doesn't really appreciate or like at the time. But God has a point. And God is saying, I still have a plan. I'm still in charge. I haven't lost control. And this conversation that goes back and forth between Habakkuk and God ultimately results in Habakkuk realizing, you know what, God can be trusted and God is in charge. And that, by the way, is a message that you and I still need to hear today. So as we dive into Habakkuk next time, we're going to look at chapter 1, and we're going to start to see this incredible conversation between God and Habakkuk, and that's going to be a conversation helpful for you and I. I want to show you what the first 11 verses in the book of Habakkuk are all about. This short little book is really just a conversation between the prophet Habakkuk and God. Here's how the book's structured. First, Habakkuk makes a big complaint to God. But then God hears his complaint and he responds. Habakkuk, however, does not like or agree with God's response, and so he complains again. God then responds to Habakkuk's complaint here in chapter 2. And finally, the prophet realizes that God is right. And so he writes this last chapter, which is really just a hymn of praise. Let's take a closer look to see what's going on. Let's look here at the first 4 verses where Habakkuk pours out his first complaint to God. Really, he in these first 4 verses, he lists his complaints up here, and then down here he describes all the evil that's going on in the world around him. Habakkuk's going to ask 4 questions, 4 kind of almost accusing questions of God. He's going to ask these 4 questions here. The first 2 questions are kind of like how long questions. And then the last 2 questions here are why questions. Let's take a look at these. First, the how long questions. How long shall I cry for help and you will not hear? That's a pretty pointed question. God, how long is it going to be that I'm going to be asking and crying out for help, but you won't even hear? Here's the next how long question. How long am I going to be crying to you? Violence. And by the way, violence is going to be a key concept in this text. How long am I going to be crying to you? Violence. And you will not save. Can you hear just right off the bat the prophet's angst even towards God? God, you're just letting the wicked win here in Judah. Those are the how long questions. Now for the why questions. Why do you make me see iniquity? And then this question, why do you idly look at wrong? That is a pointed question, right? God, why is it that you're just being lazy and watching sin run rampant? Then Habakkuk, what he does is there's so much sin going on in his society that he starts to list all the different sin here. There's all kinds of destruction and violence. There's that word again. There's lots of strife and contention. He says there's no justice, and listen to how he describes how there's no justice. The law is paralyzed. Justice never goes forth. The wicked surround the righteous, and justice goes forth perverted. And you could almost put like little air quotes around justice. It's just so-called justice, right? It's perverted. And so Habakkuk calls out to God and he complains, God, why are you letting this happen this way? And then the Lord responds. And here's one of the things that we're going to find in the book of Habakkuk. Oftentimes, when God responds, God solves problems in ways that you and I don't like, and maybe even you and I don't agree with. That's going to happen here in these verses from 5 all the way down through 11. God's going to respond, but Habakkuk is not really going to agree or appreciate God's response. Here's what God's going to say. God is essentially going to say, I am doing something, Habakkuk. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, and I'm going to use them to come and invade Judah and discipline my people for all their sin. That was hardly the response that Habakkuk was expecting. Let's take a closer look. Here in verses 5 and 6, remember Habakkuk had accused God of really being idle over here. You're idly looking at wrong. But God responds to Habakkuk and he says, I'm not being idle. I'm not being lazy. God's saying, I am doing a work. I'm doing a work in your days. Look at these verses. God responds, look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation. And he goes on, but God is going to raise up the Babylonians. You know, we talked last time how the Babylonians rose to power. That wasn't just random chance. Do you hear how God describes this? He says, I am raising up the Chaldeans. So what work is God doing? Well, God is doing this work. He's raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, to come invade his own people to discipline them. And does that seem to you surprising? Well, that's what God says. He's expecting this to be surprising. Wonder, be astonished. He says, you wouldn't even believe it if I told you. God is raising up the Babylonians to discipline his own people. Now, verses 6 through 11, really, it's just one long description of how really evil the Babylonians are. It describes how powerful they are and how strong they are. And I want you to notice the repetition of the word they. I'm going to circle several of them because these are all who's the they? Well, it's the Babylonians. So notice this, their horses. It just keeps going on like this. These are all descriptions of a certain group of people, and it's the Babylonians. So what's so bad about Babylon? Well, God lists a lot of things that are going wrong. He says all these theys refer to the Babylonians. They are a bitter and hasty nation. They seize dwellings not their own. They just sweep in and take things. They are dreaded and fearsome. Justice and dignity go forth from themselves. No one's going to tell them what to do. They tell everybody else how to respond. And they are powerful. They have horses that are swift, swifter than leopards. They're fierce. The people who ride the horses are proud. They come from afar, and they're fast. They fly like an eagle. They're swift. And they come for what? Violence. So God's people are guilty of violence, and he's going to discipline them with a violent nation. And they even gather captives. And that's important because that's what's going to happen to Israel. They're going to be taken captive all the way over to Babylon. God continues to describe how evil the Babylonians are. They mock. So they come up to a nation they're about to devour, and the people try to stop them, and the kings scoff. They laugh. They laugh at every fortress. Like, ha, you think that can stop us? They just pile up the earth, and then they take it. And you hear the images of quickness. They sweep in. And these aren't righteous people that God is using to discipline his own children. These are guilty people. They don't worship God. Who is their God? Their own might is their God. So God replies to Habakkuk, I'm not being lazy. I am doing something. I'm doing a work that might surprise you. I'm bringing the Babylonians to come, and they will discipline my people. I want to show you what these verses in the book of Habakkuk are all about. Remember that the book of Habakkuk, it's a very short book, but here's how it works. It's really just a conversation between the prophet Habakkuk and God. Habakkuk asks in the first part of chapter 1, God, why is it that you're just idly sitting by and not disciplining the people in Judah because of their sin? Then God responds with a very surprising answer. God responds by saying, I'm not sitting idle. I'm raising up the wicked Babylonians, and they're going to come and discipline the people in Judah and take them away as captives. Habakkuk hears this, and he is shocked and abhorred, and he's really struggling with God's answer. This is not the answer Habakkuk expected or looked for. This is rather shocking for him. And so he complains again to God. And that's what this section in the book is really all about. Let's take a closer look at this section. Now, it's important to realize that Habakkuk, he's not against the idea of God disciplining the Jews. In fact, that's why he started his complaint in the first place. God, people are just being so wicked, and why won't you do anything? Habakkuk is pro-discipline. But the thing that in this section here that really gets him upset, it's not that God would discipline the Jews. It's how on earth could you discipline the Jews like that? Habakkuk, his logic kind of goes like this. If God is holy and pure, sure, he can discipline his people, but surely he wouldn't do that with a nation that's more wicked than Judah, would he? And so Habakkuk, in this section, he's trying to wrap his mind around this idea. First, if God is holy, and if he's pure, and if he can't let evil go unpunished. But what's confusing is that God is promising to raise up the wicked Babylonians. Doesn't that count as letting evil and wickedness go unpunished? So Habakkuk is trying to figure these things out, and so he complains again to God. Let's take a look here in verses 12 and 13. In verse 12, he appeals to God's holiness. He says that God, my Holy One, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? He realizes God is eternal and God is holy. But he's realizing, but God, you're saying that you have ordained them as a judgment. Them, that's the Babylonians that God had just been describing. So this is not making sense. And so as Habakkuk thinks about this, God ordained them, and he's established them for the tool God would use to reprove the people of Judah. This doesn't make sense. And he's saying, again, God, you have pure eyes than to see evil. You can't look at wrong. How can you use Babylon? And he makes another pretty bold accusation. Why do you idly look at traitors? And why do you remain silent? What a charge against God. God, how dare you sit idly by? Remember that this is not the first time that Habakkuk has accused God of being idle. All the way back in verse 3, he talks about this. Why do you idly look at wrong? And so then again, here he is accusing God of just being idle, being lazy. How can you be idle as Babylon comes? And how can you be silent? And again, it's not the idea, his problem is not that God's disciplining the Jews, it's that someone that's more wicked than the Jews is what God is using. Notice this, remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he. See, that's his problem. It's someone who's, the wicked is being used, the Babylonians, they're more wicked than the Jews are. So God, how can you use them to discipline us? Here's if I could sum it up. God, if you're holy, how on earth can you use people who are really wicked to discipline your own people? And so to kind of highlight how wrong this is, Habakkuk's going to spend the next couple of verses, and in these verses, he's really trying to show how vulnerable the Jews are. And he's going to use a fishing metaphor. That's actually the fishing metaphor runs through the rest of the chapter. He says it's kind of like this. Just as the fish of the sea, just as they are vulnerable and they have no protector, God, you made us vulnerable. And it's like we have no protector against Babylon. You know, in the sea, it's kind of every fish for himself. There's no organized protector for the fish from the fishermen. The fishermen just come, they take what they want, what they need, what they can catch, and then they leave. Habakkuk's saying, you make mankind. You're making us like the fish of the sea. You're making us like the things that have no ruler. You're making us like people who have no one to protect them. You have made us vulnerable. And then in the rest of the verses, he's talking about how Babylon comes and it's like they're the fishermen. They're the evil fishermen. Listen for all of the fishing metaphors. Talks about a hook and nets. And again, net and drag net and net. Do you hear how Babylon is like the fishermen coming to harvest all the fish? And God, you made us to be like the fish with no protector, no ruler. What's interesting is that the Babylonians kind of stole the barbaric practices of the Assyrians. The Assyrians, when they would take captive people, they would make a hole in the lip and they'd put a hook through the captive's lip and put a string on it and pull the captives along with that string. That's actually how the Babylonians would sometimes bring their captives back. Some think that the Babylonians dragged their captives away as well in a net. There's this stone relief, Babylonian stone relief, that depicts one of their gods dragging captives away in a large net. And so perhaps that's what Habakkuk has in mind. God showed him this is what's going to happen. And he's saying, how can you use Babylon? They're more wicked than we are, and yet you're using them to come and take us. This is disturbing stuff. The Babylonians had this way of kind of being arrogant. It's like they sacrifice to their net. They make offerings to their net. They're worshiping their own strength. You saw this back in verse 11, where God was describing the Babylonians, and it said their own might is their God. Kind of a similar idea here. They're worshiping themselves and their own tools of the trade. And what happens is by these tools of the trade, they get rich. In other words, when a fisherman goes into the sea, he catches fish, he becomes rich, lives in luxury. When Babylon's going to come like a fisherman and take all the food and all the captives, they're going to live in luxury because they get all the loot. And Habakkuk is just disturbed by this idea. How can God do this? And is God really just going to let this happen? In verse 17, is he, the Babylonian, is he going to just keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? God, are you just going to sit and idly watch as this nation that's more wicked than us, as they come and they destroy people, especially your own people? This is just beyond what Habakkuk can understand. And so he's puzzled by this. And we move on to chapter 2, and this section really ends with Habakkuk. He's had his say. He's had his complaint. And so now he's like, I'm just going to listen. I've had my say. God, what are you going to respond? He says, I will take my stand at my watch post, station myself on the tower. Prophets often were called the watchmen. They were the one waiting. And so he's like, I'm going to stand on my post, and I'm going to look out to see what he will say to me. Habakkuk saying, I've had my say. God, what you going to respond with? By the way, I actually think there's something good about this. Habakkuk realizes that he's, I think, called God made some pretty strong accusations against God. You've been idle. He says, how long will you not listen? How long will you not save? And now it's his time to listen to God. But actually, that's a really good approach. You know, sometimes God acts in ways that we don't understand, that do not make sense to us, similar to what was happening with Habakkuk. And when that happens, I think it's okay for us to pour out our heart to God, but then we've got to wait and listen to what God says in response. In other words, when it comes to the confusing ways of God, we have to allow God to shape our beliefs about God. Instead of us saying, God, this is what you're like and I don't like it, we can pour out our hearts to God, but then at the end of the day, like Habakkuk, we've got to say, okay, God, you tell me, you shape my perspective about who you are, and even perhaps show me how I've got to answer for my complaints. And God will answer Habakkuk, and Habakkuk will come around to see things God's way. I want to show you what Habakkuk chapter 2 is all about. Let's remember where we've been in the book of Habakkuk so far. Remember that Habakkuk is a conversation between the prophet and God. Habakkuk looks at the wickedness around him in Judah, and he cries out to God, why are you being so lazy and idle? Why won't you do anything about it? God hears this complaint, and God responds. He says something rather surprising to Habakkuk. He says, I'm not being lazy, I'm not being idle. I'm actually going to raise up the wicked Babylonian nation, and they're going to come and discipline Judah. Habakkuk hears this and is horrified, and he calls out to God, and he complains, God, Babylon's more wicked than we are. How is that righteous or just? How can you use a nation like Babylon to discipline your own people? Habakkuk is really frustrated by this, and so in the first part of chapter 2, he ends his complaint and he says, I'm just going to sit here and wait till God responds and kind of tells me how this can all work out. In chapter 2, that is exactly what God does. God responds to Habakkuk's complaint. And essentially, here's what God's going to say. He's going to say, yes, Babylon is more wicked, but don't worry, Habakkuk, in the right time, in the right way, I will discipline Babylon too. They're not just going to get off the hook. And this is the message, this is the vision that Habakkuk the prophet hears and responds to in chapter 3. Let's go ahead and take a closer look now at chapter 2. What we find is a vision that God gives to Habakkuk. And first, what Habakkuk is supposed to do, God gives some instructions to Habakkuk for what he's supposed to do with the vision he's about to see. And so the instructions really come here in verses 2 and 3. What Habakkuk is supposed to do is not just listen to the vision, he's supposed to write the vision down. And he's not to write it on parchment, instead he's to write it on tablets. Now, that should maybe be a little bit surprising or might be a little shocking, because at one other point, God had also told someone to write down a message on tablets. Remember Moses. And so I think that shows kind of the significance of the vision Habakkuk is supposed to write down. Why is he to write it down? It's so that he may run who reads it. That's kind of an odd phrase, but there are some verses in Jeremiah that kind of help interpret this for us. Really what this means, what it's getting at, is that the idea is write down the vision so that messengers may run and spread the news. So that those who read it may run and spread the news. That's the idea. Now, I love what God says to Habakkuk before he kind of gives the vision. Habakkuk seemed to think that God was being lazy or idle. And God says this, if it seems slow, wait for it. In other words, Habakkuk, I'm about to give you this vision of all the judgment that's going to come on Babylon eventually. And if that seems slow, just wait. Just wait. It will surely come. It will not delay. And that's exactly what Habakkuk needed to hear, because God has an appointed time for things. And when God says something, it's not going to lie. It's not going to be wrong. And Habakkuk needed to kind of come and accept that. All right, so God's going to give this vision now to Habakkuk. And the first part of this, really, in verses 4 and 5, is kind of a statement on there's two different ways to really respond to God's judgment. First, there's the wicked. Let's talk about the wicked. The verses here describe someone whose soul is puffed up, someone who is not upright, someone who is an arrogant man, someone who is greedy, someone who really this is kind of talking about plundering, gathering himself all the nations, collecting as his own all peoples. In other words, people who go and just steal from other people's possessions. That's Babylon. That's who Babylon is. They're the wicked here, and they will not escape God's judgment. And by the way, neither will those in Judah right now in Habakkuk's day who are living in rebellion to God. So who does escape God's judgment? Well, this verse right here, this little phrase is really important. It says this, but the righteous shall live by means of his faith, by his faith. That is a really important little phrase, and it actually comes up several times in the New Testament. Paul mentions it in Romans and Galatians. It comes up again in the book of Hebrews. And that's a key theme in the New Testament. Who escapes God's punishment? Those who trust God, who come to him by faith. Okay, so there are two kinds of people. There's the wicked and there's the righteous response. Now, God is going to spend the rest of this vision telling Habakkuk about the ways in which he will discipline the nation of Babylon. And God does this really in kind of an interesting way. It's in the form of a taunt. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him? The him is Babylon, with scoffing and riddles for him. And so there's this taunt and this scoffing that's coming towards Babylon. And this is a well-organized taunt. There are 5 woes listed here in the rest of the chapter. That's how the rest of the chapter is organized. So let me try and highlight them. There's all these woes to Babylon here in verse 6, and then in verse 9, and then in verse 12, also in verse 15, and then again in verse 19. And so there's this taunt. Woe, 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 woe to Babylon. Now, what does the word woe mean? Well, sometimes it can mean like a warning, look out, watch out. But other times it can be more of a taunt, like ha. And that's really kind of the idea most likely here, because this is a taunt and a scoffing against Babylon. So let's take a moment and let's look at each one of these taunts. First one is this here in verse 6. It says this, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own. This is talking about this idea. Woe to Babylon because they plunder everybody else and so they will in turn be plundered. That's really the idea of taunt number 1. He heaps up what is not his own and loads himself with pledges. But you know what? Since you have plundered many nations, Babylon, all the remnant of the peoples will plunder you. One day the debtors are going to rise up, and you will be spoil for them, Babylon. And so that's kind of the first taunt. You thought you were going to get away with it, Babylon, but not so fast. The people you plundered, they will turn around and plunder you. That's taunt number 1. Now we come to taunt number 2 here in verse 9. Babylon thought that they could steal everybody else's stuff, then build up beautiful high houses for themselves, and thus get glory for themselves. But what God is going to say in this taunt is essentially, Babylon, you thought you were building glory for yourself, but you're actually just building shame for yourself. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. Babylon got evil gain for the purpose of building up their own house. They wanted to build their house like a nest on high, to be safe. I'm reminded of Hitler in World War II. He had built his beautiful eagle's nest, and he thought he'd be safe from all the world there, but the Allies came and overran the eagle's nest. It's kind of a similar thing was going to happen to Babylon. God's showing Habakkuk, look, they think they can build up glory for themselves, but really they're just going to build up shame for themselves. Verse 10, you have devised shame for your house. By cutting off many peoples, you've actually forfeited your own life. And it's going to be like the stones and the beams of the buildings they built are going to cry out against them. So that's kind of the second woe here, is you thought you were making glory for yourself, you're just making shame. Now on to the third woe. Here's the idea. Your violence against all the other nations, that's going to accomplish you nothing. Woe to him who builds a town with blood. That's what Babylon was doing. And the foundation of their city was going to be iniquity. But you know what? That was all for naught. And this all really came from the Lord. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that people labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing? Babylon, they were going to great lengths to build up glory for themselves, to found their city on violence, but you know what? That would all come to nothing, and that's because of the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is not now currently filled with the glory of Babylon, but in the future, the whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as waters cover the sea. That's the first 3 taunts. Now we come to the 4th and 5th taunts. Here's the 4th taunt. In order to understand this, you got to understand that in the Bible, sometimes wrath is likened to a drink in a cup. And so we talk about the cup of God's wrath. It's kind of like God's wrath is like a liquid, and you pour it into a cup, and people are made to drink it. Well, Babylon also had their own wrath that they were going to pour out on other people, and they were going to make their neighbors drink their wrath. Woe to him who makes his neighbor drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk. And the idea is Babylon was pouring out the cup of their wrath on their neighbors and embarrassing and shaming their neighbors. But instead, what goes around comes around. And the cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. And so Babylon's trying to make everyone else drink the cup of their wrath, but the cup of God's wrath is going to come around to them, and they will be instead put to shame. Then one more woe here we'll talk about here from verses 18 and on. The woe comes in verse 19, but it's really all about idols. It's a woe to those who trust in idols. Notice all the images here to idols, something that's overlaid with gold and silver. There's no breath in it. The maker shaped it. And God is basically saying, Babylon, do you really think that you can go around abusing all the other nations and then trust in your own idols who are just images, just stuff you made overlaid with gold and silver? You really think that's going to save you? And so God is pronouncing a woe upon them. And this idol, there's no breath in it at all. But I love how the chapter ends. The idols, there's no breath in the idols, but you know what? The Lord is in his holy temple. God exists, and he lives in his temple, unlike the idols that are just worthless pieces of stone and wood. And since God is real and since God is alive, let all the earth keep silence before him. So God has responded to Habakkuk, and here's God's basic response. He's saying, Habakkuk, Babylon isn't just going to get away with it. Yes, I'm using them to discipline my people, but take heart, they don't just get off the hook. There's all these woes coming upon them because of their wickedness and their violence and their greed. And really, Habakkuk is left with this choice. How am I going to respond to God's answer? God's answer is that he is still just and still holy. God has his own timetable, his own appointed time for raising people up and disciplining other nations. Will Habakkuk trust God's timeline? And that's what chapter 3 is going to be all about, where Habakkuk is going to respond. And really, that's a key question for us. As we look around at the world around us, we may sometimes think, God, where are you? Are you not going to bring the wicked to justice? The question for us is the same. Will we trust God's timeline in our day and age? I want to show you how the book of Habakkuk comes to an end. Really, it's kind of an amazing way for this book to end, because God has shown Habakkuk that he is going to discipline the nation of Judah, and it's going to be terrible. Babylon is going to come and wipe away the people of Judah and take them captive. And Habakkuk hears this and he's in horror, but really his response is what we're going to see in this last chapter of the book, and it's amazing. What's amazing about it is that Habakkuk is terrified by what he hears. You can see that in verse 16, where he says that his body is trembling and his lips are quivering and his legs tremble. But what he says is going to be amazing. He's going to express not his anger, but his loyalty to God. And that's a lesson that's helpful for us today. Let's remember what's going on in this book. Remember, Habakkuk complains to God here in chapter 1 about all the evilness going on in Judah, and then God responds and says, oh, I'm not being lazy or idle. I'm going to do a work. I'm going to bring Babylon, and they're going to discipline my people. Habakkuk hears this and he thinks, but God, he complains again, God, how can you use a wicked nation to discipline us? How is that right? And God responds in chapter 2 and he says, oh, Habakkuk, but I will discipline Babylon in just the right time. And so the way this book ends here is Habakkuk's response in chapter 3. And it's a response of loyalty. Let's talk a little bit about this response. This whole chapter, it's in the genre of a prayer. You get a sense for that here in verse 1. It says that Habakkuk is writing a prayer. This is a prayer of Habakkuk, and it's actually a song. It's according to Shigionoth. Now, what in the world is that? We don't know exactly, but this language sounds very similar to the language of the Psalms, where it's according to a kind of an instrument. So perhaps a Shigionoth is an instrument, or it could even be a musical style. But this whole chapter is a prayer, and it's something that is to be sung. Notice this over here in verse 19. The last phrase of the book says this, that it's to the choir master with stringed instruments. So perhaps the Shigionoth is a stringed instrument. In any event, this song of praise is how Habakkuk responds to God. A couple notes about the structure. You kind of have three sections. In the first section, it's kind of the introduction. And then in this middle section here, Habakkuk recounts the mighty works of God, the mighty ways that God has disciplined his enemies, poured out wrath on his enemies in the past. And then in verses 16 to 19 here, we get Habakkuk's expression of loyalty to God. And the whole point of this last chapter is to say, God, I submit to your timetable and your plan for the ages. Let's take a look at each section. First section here, we notice that this is a prayer, and it's according perhaps to this instrument or to that style of music. Interestingly, Habakkuk the prophet is named again. It's like he's trying to say, these are my own words. In verse 2, Habakkuk says something very interesting. He says, I have heard the report of you and your work, O Lord, do I fear. Remember, that word work is interesting because all the way back in chapter 1, remember what did Habakkuk complain about? He was complaining, God, why are you so idle? But this chapter is going to be Habakkuk recounting all the ways that God has worked in the past by disciplining his enemies. I've heard about your work, and he wants God to revive it and to make it known. He says this phrase here, in wrath, remember mercy. Habakkuk realizes that God is going to discipline Israel, the Jews, and he realizes that God's wrath is coming, but he's saying, God, but still remember mercy. Okay, that's the first little intro. Now what we find in kind of this main middle section is Habakkuk is remembering all the ways that God has disciplined his enemies in the past and fought for Israel. And so it's actually a difficult passage to interpret because it's so poetic. But what you're going to find are a lot of images referring to God's actions in bringing Israel out of Egypt and how God disciplined the people of Canaan as God brought the people into the promised land. Here's another note about the structure. In verses 3 through 7, you find words about God. And then in verses 8 through 15, Habakkuk addresses God. These are words to God. That's another important point. Okay, let's take a closer look and see what Habakkuk is talking about as he recounts God's work. He says this in verse 3, God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Now, that is not a specific reference to Mount Sinai, but these places, Teman and Paran, these are places from the south. And so kind of the idea is when God brought Israel out of Egypt into the promised land, he came from the south. And perhaps the image here in verse 3 and 4 is describing God's power came like a massive thunderstorm. That's how some commentators interpret this phrase here. His splendor covered the heavens. It's like a thunderstorm comes. That's God bringing his might and his power and his people into the promised land. And his brightness was like the light rays flashed from his hand. And so perhaps the idea is God's coming like a thunderstorm. Verse 5 talks about this. Before him, before God, went pestilence and plague followed at his heels. Now, I think that's a reference to Egypt. Remember, God had brought the pestilence and the plagues on Egypt. I think Habakkuk's remembering that. And God is disciplining the nations like Egypt and Canaan. And all he has to do is look. He looked and shook the nations. And by the way, I love that. What does God have to do to terrify the nations? He just has to look at them. That's all. In verse 7, it says this, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. These are places around Egypt and from the south. And so it's kind of recounting God's discipline came from the south as he brought Israel into the promised land. Now as we come to verse 8, Habakkuk is speaking to God. So notice all the words are you and your here. And so Habakkuk is addressing God head on. And verse 8 is very colorful. He's remembering, I think, the way that God, when God's disciplining Egypt and Canaan, a lot happened to the water. He says this, was your wrath against the rivers, your anger against the rivers, indignation against the sea? In what way were rivers affected when God brought Israel out of Egypt? Well, remember, God cursed the Nile and so that it turned to blood, and he stopped the Jordan River so that the people could pass through. And it's kind of like God came on his horse and on a chariot of salvation and brought Israel into the promised land. And it's kind of this imagery here is how God, it's like he's taking out his weapons. He stripped the sheath from his bow. He called for the arrows, and everything is terrified of God. The mountains saw you and writhed. Mount Sinai, by the way, quaked when God came to it. And then in verse 11, I think we hear a reference to the conquest. It says, the sun and moon stood still in their place. When did we see that happening? Well, in Joshua chapter 10, the sun stood still from Joshua's perspective. It stopped in the sky and allowed them to defeat their enemies. And verse 12, again, it's just all this image of how God marched through the earth and disciplined the nations. God is bringing salvation to his people. He's disciplining the wicked. He's crushing the wicked and laying him bare and piercing him with his own arrows. And so this is a terrifying thing. If you're the one on the receiving end of God's wrath, that is a terrifying thing. One more image here. I think this is referring to how God parted the Red Sea. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. What a poetic way of describing how God parted the Red Sea. It's a terrifying thing to be on the receiving end of God's discipline. But here's the thing. Now who's on the receiving end of God's discipline? It's not other nations like Egypt or Canaan. It's Israel. It's Judah. And so as Habakkuk reflects on that causes him to tremble. And that's what this last section says. My body trembles, my lips quiver. It's like rottenness. My bones have become rotten and my legs tremble. As Habakkuk thinks about the discipline that's coming when God raises up Babylon, he is terrified. But I want you to notice, this is really in many ways the climax of the book. I want you to notice what Habakkuk does. First, he responds with patience. He says, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon those who invade us. He's realizing, I'm going to submit to God's timetable for justice. God is going to judge us first, and then he's going to judge Babylon. And I will patiently wait for that discipline to come upon Babylon. I think this shows us Habakkuk is convinced that God is still a good God. And then these verses, 17 to 18, are so amazing. Essentially, he's saying, God, even though everything fails, yet I will still praise you. He talks about how though the fig tree won't blossom, even if there's no fruit on the vines, even if the olives fail, even if the fields have no food, we see here these references to fields and fruits. But even if it's not just that fails, even if the flocks are cut off, and even if there's no herds in the stalls. So he's saying, even if there's complete barrenness, what will my response be? Even if there's complete barrenness, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. What we find here is nothing short of a miraculous faith. Habakkuk sees that God is going to judge Judah, and yet he says, but God is good. And even if that all comes, I'm still going to be loyal to God. I'll still rejoice in the Lord. Two things can be true at the same time. You can have your knees trembling with the thought of what God will allow, and you can still be loyal to God. I think we see something, by the way, very similar when Jesus, on the night before he's crucified, He's sweating drops of blood, and yet he says, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Okay, now the book ends with verse 19. He says, God, the Lord, is my strength. That's where his strength is going to come to make it through this discipline that's coming. He says, he makes my feet like the deer's, makes me tread upon my high places. Remember, his legs were in verse 16 trembling, but now they're steady as a deer on a high place. God is the one who gives him strength. And so what you have in the book of Habakkuk is really this beautiful picture. Sometimes God disciplines even his own people, but God is just and his timetable is right. And the right response is the response Habakkuk had in chapter 3, is to sing a song of praise and say, God, your will be done. Thank you guys so much for joining us in our journey through the book of Habakkuk, and I hope you will join us again next time.